Launching the English opening immediately challenges black's central influence and prepares for queenside expansion. Setting up a solid pawn chain, preparing to contest the center without immediate pawn confrontation. Opening the center with e4 immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to seize space. Challenging the center immediately creates rich pawn tension, demanding precise calculation from both sides. Opening the center dramatically reshapes the board's geometry. Reclaiming the center immediately is key. Black solidifies central presence and opens lines for development. Asserting central control, white immediately challenges black's pawn chain and aims for a commanding pawn majority. Developing the knight here aims to contest the center and prepare castling, a sensible reaction to white's ambitious pawn push. Securing the center further, this knight aims to support the pawn chain and prepare for kingside development. Solidifying the center while preparing for queenside expansion, this move initiates a common Slav structure and aims for harmonious piece development. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing to develop the king's bishop are key objectives now. Developing the bishop clears the way for castling and prepares for central pawn play. Challenging black's central foothold, this pawn push aims to confine the bishop and gain queenside space. Securing the monarch is paramount, enabling queenside expansion and active piece maneuvering. Developing the bishop towards the center prepares castling and supports the pawn chain's advance. Challenging the queenside pawn chain, b6 aims to liberate the c8 bishop and potentially create a strong outpost on c5 for your knights. Expanding queenside control aims to restrict black's counterplay and potentially create passed pawns. Aggressively contesting the queenside by challenging the pawn chain immediately seizes initiative, but beware of creating weaknesses. Preparing to anchor a knight on a robust outpost while potentially disrupting black's queenside ambitions. Developing the knight to a centralizing outpost, this maneuver prepares for a queenside expansion while reinforcing the d5 pawn. Solidifying central space, this pawn push aims to restrict black's queenside maneuvering and create potential attacking avenues on the kingside. Liberating the bishop and opening lines for attack, a daring gambit for queenside initiative. Capturing the pawn strategically unwraps the central pawn structure, opening lines for your pieces and creating an immediate imbalance. Black bravely sacrifices a pawn to crack open the center and ignite counterplay along the now active e file. Piercing the center with this pawn creates immediate tension, aiming to destabilize black's knight and potentially disrupt their pawn structure. Sacrificing pawn structure for an active knight sortie, black dares white's king to venture too far forward. Sacrificing the pawn opens critical lines, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure and exploit its exposed monarch. Reclaiming a pawn is tempting, but that knight's outpost on d7 is crucial for defending your weakened queenside. Securing the king's safety through castling often sets the stage for future skirmishes, even if it doesn't immediately alter the pawn structure. Sacrificing the knight unlocks a central pawn majority, aiming for rapid development and a dangerous initiative. Unleashing the queen into the center now, white aims to exploit the exposed black king and seize control of the central squares. Unleashing the knight to e5 targets white's central control and aims to disrupt their pawn chain. Shifting the queen to g3 initiates an aggressive diagonal assault aimed directly at the kingside. Releasing the central pawn tension opens lines and allows for potential piece activation on the queenside. Recapturing the queen preserves material balance, but the exposed kingside pawn structure may become a future target. Activating the bishop to the central diagonal now prepares for pawn advances and potential threats against white's king. Asserting bishop influence, this maneuver aims to pressure the queenside and potentially disrupt black's structure. Asserting pressure on the open d-file, the rook now eyes potential entry points. Unlocking the d-file presents a significant challenge to black's weakened pawn structure. Centralizing the queen creates a strong defensive hub and eyes open lines for potential counterplay. Focusing the rook on the d-file now allows for increased pressure on black's weakened central pawns. Developing the bishop to this active square pins down the crucial central squares and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the king side, adding pressure to white's somewhat cramped position. Reclaiming central presence, the knight re-establishes vital influence over key squares after its earlier sortie, preparing for more active deployment. Pressing the queenside pawn advances the queen to a more aggressive square, eyeing potential weaknesses. Consolidating control over the open file solidifies white's central advantage. Asserting the open c-file with this rook solidifies black's control and prepares for further pressure along the central vertical. Activating the rook along the third rank, this maneuver aims to bolster the queenside pawn structure while preparing for a potential exchange sacrifice. Black centralizes the queen, but opens lines for white's rooks, creating sharp tactical possibilities. The knight's journey to e2 aims to support the d3 pawn and prepare for kingside expansion, potentially rerouting to f4 or g3. Unleashing a potent counterattack, black reclaims central influence and pressures white's weakened queenside structure. Focusing the knight on the critical d4 square disrupts black's queenside pressure and prepares a central crackdown. Gambiting the queen for initiative, black opens lines hoping to exploit white's somewhat exposed king, a risky but dynamic choice. Unleashing pressure along the open c-file, preparing to exploit the exposed black monarch. Exploring the queenside vacuum, this maneuver aims to reposition your queen for a more active role, potentially targeting white's less defended pawns. Shifting the queen to a safer square dodges the bishop's attack and sets up potential counterplay. Opening the e-file for the rook aims to challenge white's central pawn control and create counterplay. Concentrating the queen on the d-file to potentially contest it, while eyeing any weaknesses on the king side. Repositioning the bishop to g6 aims to pressure white's center and potentially open lines for attack. Opening that vital d-file creates immediate pressure, potentially isolating black's queen and disrupting their defensive setup. Seizing the open b-file, black initiates a sharp counterattack, aiming to disrupt white's queenside coordination. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure, this subtly prepares for future defensive or offensive maneuvering. Reclaiming initiative, black repositions the bishop to prepare for a potential kingside defense or central pawn push. Targeting the opponent's back rank creates immediate pressure and restricts piece mobility. Reclaiming the bishop's influence on the dark squares, this defends the pawn and prepares a potential regrouping. Securing the open file solidifies white's territorial gains and prepares for further infiltration towards black's vulnerable king. Challenging white's queenside pawn structure, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's coordination and force a response. Trading queens now simplifies the position, potentially setting up a difficult endgame for black given white's better pawn structure. Exchanging the queens unlocks a starkly simplified endgame where black's rook and bishop pair can exert significant pressure. Clearing the path for the queen to exploit the now open central files creates significant pressure. Opening the f-file now creates an immediate threat against the isolated e-pawn. The rook's repositioning to the 7th rank aggressively pressures black's weakened pawns and limits the bishop's scope. Unleashing the rook creates dynamic counterplay, aiming to exploit white's somewhat exposed king and potential weaknesses. Sacrificing the rook opens lines and forces the king into a precarious central position. Trading the rook for the pawn immediately opens critical lines, bringing the opposing king into immediate danger. Securing the king's escape route becomes paramount with this cautious repositioning. Mobilizing the rook to the critical 7th rank promises aggressive endgame prospects. Pushing the rook to the 7th rank aggressively pressures black's weakened position. Reactivating the kingside attack with a rook transfer can put white's pieces in disarray. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, preparing to contest the central files. Relocating the king to g8 offers better protection, anticipating potential piece incursions and securing a safer haven amidst the active battlefield. Pivoting the rook to a newly acquired open file to pressure the weakened king position. Bringing the rook to the center aims to create counterplay along the third rank, contesting white's initiative. King's safety is now paramount, forcing the opponent to address the immediate check and potentially disrupting their pawn structure. A moment of respite for the besieged monarch, as the king cautiously retreats to safety from the aggressive pawn sacrifice. Shifting the rook allows it to support potential pawn advances and coordinate with its counterpart on the h-file, aiming to disrupt black's king's safety. The king retreats, preparing to defend the central pawns and await any further action from white's powerful rook. Consolidating the monarch to the central light square's safeguards against potential raids and prepares for endgame maneuvering. Preparing to defend the weakened kingside by repositioning the rook. Proactively shifting the king towards the center begins the crucial endgame maneuver. Shifting the rook to the third rank aims to create more robust defensive cover around the king. Initiating a decisive attack on the enemy king, forcing it into a vulnerable position. Doubling down on defense with the rook, a risky maneuver given white's open king. Regaining the d-file offers a clear path to exploit black's uncoordinated pieces. Reclaiming the central files is paramount now. The rook on f6 eyes that open territory. Asserting dominance on the queen side, this rook's repositioning aims to dismantle black's tenacious pawn structure and restrict the opposition. Retreating the king from the d-file's pressure offers some breathing room, but its central placement remains exposed. Asserting control over the critical 7th rank now aims to restrict black's rook and prepare for further advances. Seeking to untangle his rook and free the king from potential pressure on the g-file. Fortifying the rook's presence on the 6th rank, aiming to box in the enemy king. Reactivating the g-file presents an intriguing counter-initiative. Unleashing a discovered check, white forces the king to a precarious square, setting up potential mating nets. Repositioning the rook defensively on the f-file attempts to halt white's pawn's advance and fortify the king's sanctuary. The rook exchange solidifies the king's safety and offers a clear path to victory by clearing the way for the remaining pawns. The king's safety is paramount, now emerging from its protective pawn shield to seek active participation in the concluding stages of the battle. Capturing that pawn loosens the king's defensive structure significantly. Relocating the king to a safer, central square becomes paramount in this rook and pawn endgame. Pawns advance, seeking to unravel the enemy's tightly held defensive structure. Pushing this pawn aims to complicate the endgame, seeking counterplay by opening lines for the king. Initiating a kingside attack with the rook, aiming to exploit black's exposed monarch. Seeking to disrupt white's pawn advance and gain activity for the rook. King's central approach aims to solidify the pawn majority and restrict black's activity. Reactivating the rook to threaten the pawn chain, aiming to exploit white's exposed king. Securing the passed pawn's advance initiates a strategic race. A daring maneuver, aiming to reposition the king and potentially defend the d-pawn, but it leaves the monarchy exposed. Consolidating the rook on the central file offers a strong positional advantage, preparing for further pawn advances and potential harassment of black's king. Shifting the rook to the d-file aims to penetrate white's pawn structure, but it might expose the rook to immediate counterplay. Shifting the king towards the center prepares for the inevitable pawn advances and potential mating threats. Boldly centralizing the king here attempts to activate a dormant piece, a gambit for potential counterplay. Centralizing the king offers the best path to consolidating this endgame advantage. Confronting the white king's exposed position demands a dynamic reshuffle of your defensive forces to establish counterplay. Exposing the black king with a check forces it into a dangerous, centralized position. King's pursuit of the isolated pawn now faces immediate threat from the advancing white rook. Pushing the g-pawn advances the kingside structure, potentially creating weaknesses for black's monarch in the long run. challenging the rook's dominion over the 7th rank, seeking a more active rook placement. This rook retreat reclaims the initiative on the d-file, aiming to support the advancing pawn and restrict black's activity. Repositioning the king to safety allows for increased activity and prepares for the coming pawn struggles. Sacrificing the rook opens a clear path for the king to become a fearsome attacking force. The rook retreats, seeking better defense for its king, while the white pawn pushes forward, threatening to dominate the remaining board. Probing for weaknesses, the rook advances to threaten the isolated pawn, aiming to exploit black's compromised queenside. A desperate attempt to disrupt white's advancing pawns by forcing a king check. Activating the king to coordinate with the rook is key to exploiting black's weakened king's safety. King makes a bid for freedom, seeking active participation in the emerging skirmish. Gaining the open file with the rook is a primary objective now, preparing to penetrate black's weakened pawn structure. Sensing an opening, the rook sprints to the 1st rank, challenging white's king's safety. Unleashing a discovered attack, this move forces the black king out of its protective pawn shield. Initiating a controlled retreat to safeguard the king amidst the emerging pawn storm. Pushing the king forward signals an aggressive intent to dominate the weakened queenside. Seeking respite, the rook retreats, preparing to support the advance of the remaining pawns. Initiating a pawn storm to seize more territory and potentially unravel black's defenses. Seizing the open file with the rook dramatically shifts the endgame's dynamics, threatening immediate incursions. Activating the rook to support the pawn push and control the open file. Repositioning the rook to the wing aims to disrupt white's coordinated advance. Pushing the rook forward, preparing to trap black's exposed monarch. King hunters now surge forward with regal intent, seeking to expose the monarch and seal victory. Unleashing the king offers a glimmer of counterplay amidst the pawn storm, hoping for a tactical skirmish. Initiating a desperate infiltration along the 1st rank, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety. Forcing the black king to move again, consolidating the rook's pressure along the 7th rank. Finally, black's monarch seeks refuge on the 8th rank, hoping to escape the impending rook storm. Advancing the king to a more active central square now, eyeing potential pawn pushes and offering counterplay. Capturing the pawn with the rook now allows black to regroup their forces and potentially consolidate their defensive structure, though the king remains quite exposed. Initiating a pawn storm to escort the king to safety across the open territory. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential demands this centralizing advance. Pushing this pawn will solidify your king's safety and restrict black's counterplay. Black gambits the pawn, hoping to create an unstoppable passed pawn on the d-file with king support. The promotion threat is now immense, forcing a swift defense of the 7th rank.